Good evening. Welcome to St. Paul Lutheran Church. We are committed as a congregation to being in the community, to serving the community in all the ways that we can, and please God, to being a benefit to the community. I am Peter Pettit, teaching pastor here at St. Paul, and I'll be leading the session this evening on the Hamas-Israel war, what's behind it. As we get started, before we ever talk about causes, before we ever talk about background, before we ever talk about morality or analysis or blame or any of that, I think we have to acknowledge the sadness of a tragedy that is unfolding in Israel and across Palestine, especially in Gaza. It is a human tragedy, and tragedies of this scale really don't pay much attention to personal identity. If you end up in harm's way, it hurts you, and a lot of people are hurting this evening. So as we gather, I would invite us first and foremost to hold in our hearts those who have died and their families and all who love them, those who are injured and in need of healing and care, those who have been displaced from their homes and seek shelter and comfort, those who have become captives, all those who are in the immediate field of danger, and that we hold them in our hearts and hold them in whatever form of prayers we might offer. One of the questions we could start with this evening is, why is this being discussed as the Hamas-Israel war? And it's an important question and a very helpful one, really, because it shows an effort to be very specific and very accurate about what is underway. 2 days ago, I believe it was, President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah in the West Bank made it very clear that from his perspective as the Palestinian president, the attack that took place in the communities of southern Israel on October 7th, in his words, do not represent the Palestinian people. They were attacks by a group called Hamas, and we will explore this evening something more of who they are and what that means. But to say that one side of this war is Hamas is, particularly with President Abbas's comments, especially significant and specific and clear. To say that Israel is on the other side of this war is in some ways a little less clear, because on the one hand, the way that Hamas launched its attacks, it clearly was aimed at Israel as a country, at Jews as a people, at whatever target was available once the fighters broke out of Gaza and began their assault. If it had anything to do with Israel, it was a fair target. So in that sense, it is Israel that is on the other side of this war. On the other hand, it's helpful to remember that the Israeli people have taken no votes. They have had no referendums. They have not collectively reached a consensus that they have expressed. It's this government of Israel that is choosing how to respond. And so to talk about it as the Hamas-Israel war helps us with clarity and accuracy about what's going on. And that's crucial because the issues in this are really, really complex. The feelings that we bring to this in response to what we're seeing and hearing, maybe it's just from the news, maybe it's from friends, maybe it's from family, maybe it's from people who finally were able to get out of their trip to that region and back here to the Quad Cities just yesterday. Our feelings about it are equally complex. There are gruesome images, there is human devastation, there are stomach-churning reports, and there are impassioned outcries. And it really doesn't matter which party to the war you're listening to, you're hearing all of that. We're hearing all of that from both sides of the border and from a host of advocates and allies and analysts around the world. And all of that, with every news cycle, just churns the emotions again. What I want to suggest this evening and hopefully provide is a little bit of clarity about what's behind this, where it comes from. And that, I think, can be aided by identifying different dimensions of the conflict and adding information. That's this forum's goal. I can't tell you what's behind it from the standpoint of sitting in the rooms where people are making decisions either about attacking Israel or about responding to that attack. I don't have that kind of privilege. But in terms of the broad background of the context in which this is happening, I hope that I can provide that. If you came tonight for a rally, you'll be disappointed. If you came tonight for a debate, you'll be disappointed. If you came tonight for a definitive answer, I'm afraid you might still be disappointed. But if you came for some resources to help you wrestle with and understand a complicated situation with enormous moral challenges that feels unimaginable and unresolvable, then I hope that you'll find this helpful. I want to start out by making a distinction, and you've already heard me do it to an extent. It's a distinction between this event, which is now 11 days old, and the wider, deeper context within which it is happening. This event started with an assault by Hamas on a dozen or more locations in southern Israel of all sorts of character, not only military, but also civilian. And it had very specific goals, we now know, very specific methodologies that were laid out on instruction sheets for those who took part in it. And it was undertaken on religious grounds. We know that because the fighters who came in and launched the assault were wearing the green headbands of Hamas. You see one up on the slide here, which is an Islamist resistance movement. That means it's grounded in that organization's understanding of Islam, which is not all of Islam by a long shot. But for them, their motivations, the ground of their actions is in their religious identity and commitments. There were chosen targets, there were chosen tactics that we now know about in some detail. This event moves on to Israel's response, which has been fairly swift, quite extensive, employing a broad swath of Israel's military capabilities, and it has as its stated goal to eliminate Hamas as a military threat to the state of Israel and its people. Is that an achievable goal? I have no idea. But that is the stated objective of Israel's response. And as we move through this evening, I think you'll see more about why that would be their response. That's this event. And that, I think we can describe fairly discreetly. There is, however, even within Hamas's own rhetoric, Hamas's own description, their own explanation or accounting of what it is that they're doing, there is reference to the larger picture of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the goals and the tactics of this event are not dictated by that larger picture. They were chosen specifically for this event. And Israel's response is not necessarily integrated into their engagement with the larger picture. They are responding to this assault at the moment. But the piece about the larger picture that's worth understanding and that I hope to be able to help you understand this evening is that this does take place against the background of that context. It's not an inevitable outcome of it. It's not as though this was cooked into it from 75 years ago or 130 years ago, let alone from time immemorial. But the background, because it has been invoked by Hamas particularly, is a piece that we can work to understand better. You will see if you've been looking at any of the maps, this is the Gaza Strip. In green are some of the key points within the Gaza Strip. You also have this on the back of your handout if you're looking at it. Some of the key down the left side are some of the key metropolitan areas and geographical points within the Gaza Strip that you might hear about on the news. And on the right are the locations of kibbutzim and towns and the rave festival that were going on Saturday morning the 7th that came under attack. And we'll get more into the geography of all of this. But as we start to look at the larger picture, one of the things that I want us to be aware of is that where we set the perimeter of our story, where the horizon is within which we try to understand things, makes a difference in terms of how we evaluate morality of the actors involved. And I talk about this as we go through this with these different dimensions that we'll talk about. I will feel, and I think you will too, your moral compass will swing in different directions because of the different contexts, the different circumstances, the different dimensions that are involved. Or as I've put it on other occasions, and I'll share with you here, it's kind of a moral seesaw. So if we start out with any particular act of Palestinian terror, it can be this one, it can be any other that you might think of. That's the green bubble in the middle. And that green bubble in the middle, being a Palestinian terror attack against Israeli civilians, puts the moral seesaw high on the Israel side and pretty low on the Palestinian side. But if we pull back another ring, we can think about the fact that since 1967, Israel has had a military administration or an occupation in Palestinian land. And Palestinian peoples have, for the most part, not had sovereignty, not lived in their own country, not been able to make a lot of their own decisions, certainly politically. And when you look at the plight of the Palestinians after multiple generations of living in those circumstances, then suddenly the moral seesaw flips, and the Palestinian community has rather a high moral view, and the Israeli position is somewhat lower. Or we can back up again and say, well, that's fine, but look how tiny Israel is. It's just this one little country of 9 million people in a sea of 22 Arab and Middle Eastern, largely Muslim states, and they're all Palestinian allies. So Israel, poor little Israel, and all of a sudden the moral seesaw goes up. Except that, as we know, Israel has one of the most sophisticated and well-financed militaries in the world. They are a nuclear power, although that's not official, of course, but they are. And they have amazing allies, like, for example, you and me. And so if you consider the Israeli military and Israel's allies around the world compared to the vulnerability of even the Arab states, but especially the Palestinians, now suddenly, you see what's happening to the moral seesaw? Just because what we're doing is changing the horizon within which we're considering the circumstance. I want you to be alert to that as we do it, because none of these seesaw positions is wrong. If I take that horizon, then the seesaw is high on one side and low on the other. And if I change the horizon, it does flip. The challenge for us is that they're all true. And somehow we have to figure out how to hold that all together. So what I want to suggest is that if there's one thing I hope that we can do tonight, it is that we can hold the tension of this larger context, because that is the reality of it. It isn't still going on 130 years later for no reason, because the tension is the reality of it. And if we resolve our discomfort with the tension by jumping one way or the other and deciding that one's right and that one's wrong, we might feel better, but we will have disengaged ourselves from part of the reality of what is going on. So I invite you to an hour of discomfort, or maybe more. I want to move on to one of the most significant dimensions, and in some ways one of the more complicated ones, one that can start to boggle the mind. How many of you loved your 8th grade history class? Okay, we've got a few. Excellent. The rest of you are with me. Not so much. But there is some history here that's worth talking about. And I want to start out with the history of the conflict that's underway, the broader conflict of Israel and the Palestinians, which is, in fact, only about 125 to 130 years old. It is not from time immemorial. It is not that nobody in this region could ever get along with each other. I've heard that over the past couple of weeks. I've heard that for years from some folks. But this particular conflict is actually a very modern conflict. And so I want to go through it, and for those of you who may know it in some detail, you will be offended by the brevity with which I tell this history. I hope for others who are not familiar with it, I can give it to you in 3 reasonably digestible chunks that help to give you a perspective on it. The conflict, part 1A. Okay, I'm going to cheat. There's a 1A and a 1B, but then we only get to 3. 1A, 1897 is an event called the First Zionist Congress. It takes place in Basel, Switzerland, and it's a gathering of Jews from across Europe who have decided, because of the rampant anti-Semitism that they're finding both in Eastern Europe with assaults on Jewish villages and people, often by the neighboring population, but sanctioned by the Russian Tsarist government. Because of that, and also because of a somewhat slicker, more sophisticated anti-Semitism in the enlightened Western European states like Germany and France and England, this group of Jews has come together and said, you know, the only way that we are ever going to be comfortably settled in a place where we don't have to think maybe next week we're going to have to pick up and move because we won't be welcome anymore, is if we settle in our own place and have our own government where we rule ourselves in our own land. Now, there were significant debates about where the land might be. One of the more famous ones and more interesting ones to puzzle out if you want to spend a little time on it is maybe the Jews of Europe should go to Uganda. Yeah, a good thing they didn't. But they did recognize that the homeland that they know biblically, historically, from their prayer book, is the place that is known as Ottoman Palestine. They had known it as Israel and Judah. And they said, well, if we want to go back to a place where we feel like we belong, the only place in the world that really makes sense is that place at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. And so they began a process of cultivating political support, financial support, and moving people physically into Ottoman Palestine. So called because the region had been named Palestine by the Romans 2,000 years before, and it was the Ottoman Empire in Turkey that ruled it. That was 1897. For the next 20 years or so, they continue their influx of people into Ottoman Palestine. If you know your basic 20th century history, 1914 to 1917 was the First World War. The Ottomans joined with Germany against the Western Allies, and the Ottoman Empire was destroyed. With that, both the local Arabs of Palestine and the Jews who had moved to Palestine and who still hoped to, thought and hoped and expected and prayed and yearned that this was their chance, that they could have independence. The Arabs as an Arab state, the Jews as a Jewish state. When the war ended, because the Ottoman Empire basically got carved up among the victors, and this part of the world, the Middle East, got handed over by the League of Nations to France, who got control of what's now Lebanon and Syria in the north, and Great Britain, who got control of the Palestine Mandate. And you can see on the map there that the French mandate for Syria is to the north, and the green and the gold, which are present-day Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, and Transjordan, that's the Kingdom of Jordan, that is what was given to the Brits to administer until there could be states established that could stand on their own. And part of their mandate was, within this Palestine, all of the green and gold, to create a national home for the Jewish people. In 1923, they handed over all of Transjordan, the gold, to King Abdullah of the Hashemite Kingdom. He ruled there for about 30 years. In 1946, Transjordan, under mandate but led by Abdullah, became the state or the Kingdom of Jordan as we know it today. Meanwhile, the Brits continued to administer the western part of Palestine, which is shown in green. 1b, from 1923 to 1949, this is a story of gross mismanagement by Great Britain. They promised everybody everything in all directions and couldn't make good on all of those. The Jews wanted to expand and establish their homeland. The Arabs resented their arrival and wanted to expand and establish their independence. There were about 25 years of conflict between Jews and Arabs and against the British. Again, 20th century history, the second half of this period is also World War II and the Shoah, the Holocaust. And the ideal of a Jewish homeland where Jews would be in charge and any Jewish refugee could arrive and be safe became even more important to the Jewish community. In 1947, the Brits finally said, we can't do it, we can't manage this, we can't make it work. And they took it to the United Nations, who said, all right, here's a map. We're going to divide the land between an Arab state and a Jewish state. It was called the Partition Plan. They announced it in November. Jews and Arabs immediately started fighting to position themselves, jockeying to be able to grab any extra couple of square miles they could when the Brits left in May of the next year. And when the Brits left in May of the next year, Israel declared statehood, and the war broke out between the Arab states surrounding and Israel. Realize that up to this point, there is no Palestinian entity, so to speak. It was Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq who had interest in this land and who went to war against Israel in order to keep from losing the land. The war lasted about a year, and at the end of it, we got what is now a famous map with Jordan controlling the West Bank, Egypt controlling the Gaza Strip, Syria controlling the Golan Heights in green at the top, and the purple is the state of Israel. The headline from the Palestine Post, interesting, the Palestine Post would say, "The state of Israel is born," but Palestine was a region. It was not so much a political identity yet. Palestinians call this event the establishment of Israel and the loss of the war and the loss of the land. They call it the catastrophe, because about 700,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes or left their homes to get out of harm's way and were now refugees in neighboring lands, still having the key to the house back in what's now Israel, and the deed to the property, but without access to it. It was Israel's independence, and at the same time, it was the Palestinians' catastrophe. Interestingly, the word in Arabic for catastrophe, which is Nakba, it's on your paper there, Nakba. If you translate Nakba into Hebrew, you would say Shoah, which is what Jews call the Holocaust. That's the end of part one. We have moved from the beginning of Jews moving to the area in serious numbers to the establishment of the state of Israel and the catastrophe that that felt like to the Palestinians. Part two, the next 45 years. 3 wars that the Arab states waged against Israel. 1956 Sinai Campaign, 1967 Six-Day War, 1973 Yom Kippur War. 1967 in the Six-Day War, Jordan lost the territory of the West Bank in that war. Israel moved into it and pushed the Jordanian army back and seized control of it. Egypt lost the Gaza Strip and the entire Sinai Peninsula in that war. Syria lost the Golan Heights. And there things sat from 1967 for 12 years. Because there was no peace treaty with any of these nations, Israel put in a military administration in order to manage affairs in territory they now controlled. They actually annexed the Golan Heights because of its strategic character and the idea that they would never want Syria sitting on those heights lobbing shells down on the northern part of Israel again. They also annexed the environs of the city of Jerusalem in order to unite the city. But the occupation or military administration in Gaza and the West Bank gets started after that 1967 war in anticipation of one day having a peace treaty with Jordan and with Egypt and resolving the status of that land. But Israel also started settling Israeli residents in that territory. And therein lies a significant part of the context of everything that happens later. 1979, you see Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin with Jimmy Carter signing the Egyptian Camp David Accords. That was peace with Egypt. The entire Sinai Peninsula was given back to Egypt, and Egypt said, thank you very much, we don't want Gaza. We cede, we hand over the political rights to Gaza to the Palestinians who live there. That was 1979. 15 years later, 1994, the Oslo Accords is peace with Jordan. That's Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat agreeing, and King Hussein of Jordan was also instrumental in the Oslo Accords, but that's Clinton, Rabin, and Arafat signing on the Oslo Accords because Jordan made peace with Israel and said, we don't want the West Bank back. We hand over the political rights of the West Bank to the Palestinians who live there. And this is the point at which the Palestinians get a government. It's known as the Palestinian Authority, and Yasser Arafat was the first president of the Palestinian Authority. So Israel now has peace with Egypt and Jordan, but they still don't have a resolution to the West Bank and Gaza because they don't actually end up with peace with the Palestinians. Why is that? Because in 1995, the very next year, the peace got assassinated. A radical, right-wing, religious Jew in Israel assassinated the Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who had signed the Oslo Accords and was moving this all toward peace. And with Rabin's death, Israeli society took a turn, and increasingly, settlement activity in the occupied territories and obstructionism in the negotiation process made it harder and harder and harder for Oslo finally to be concluded, which it was supposed to be done by 1999. And there would have been a Palestinian state and an Israeli state side by side at peace with each other. It never happened. Something called the Second Intifada broke out in 2002. It was a brutal uprising on the part of the Palestinians, furious that they had once again been denied. This is a period, for those of you who might remember, of bus bombings in cities in Israel. At the same time, construction of fancy, new, bright, shiny Israeli settlements in the part of the West Bank and Gaza that is supposed to be Palestine one day just keeps going and going and going and going, right up alongside impoverished Palestinian villages whose only benefit from it is maybe they get to do a job in the settlement for the Israelis who live there. This is and at the same time, in 2005-06, we'll see this more in a moment, Hamas becomes the Palestinian government in Gaza. And that's crucial background to what's been happening this week. So all of this, immigration, conflict, bad British management, establishment of the state, Nakba catastrophe, ongoing wars, settlement construction, terrorist attacks, all of this is not the conflict. That's not the conflict. That's all the result of not solving the conflict. What's the conflict? The conflict is, whose land is it? That's what the conflict is. And why is that a conflict? There are 4 lines on the timeline. The top one is when Jews were living in the land. And the dark parts of that line are when there was really serious, full-bore Jewish community in the land. The lighter ones, not so much. They had been exiled or they had been driven out of the land. There might still be some Jews living there, but certainly no established Jewish community in the land. And you can see from 135 of the Common Era to 1897, that first Zionist Congress, there are hardly any Jews in the land. Not none, but very, 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 very few. The next line, you see when the Jews ruled in the land. The first blip at the left end, 1000 to 586, that's biblical Israel. That's what you read about in the Old Testament, in the Jewish Bible. That's when Jews ruled in the land. And again, very briefly, how many of you know the story of Masada or the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans? That's the 100-year Maccabean kingdom there from 167 to 63 before the Romans wiped them out. That's the last time Jews ruled in the land. The next line is Arabs living in the land. And if you notice, serious Arab settlement really only starts in 635 of the Common Era. That's the beginning of Islam. Islam, which starts in Arabia, and it's the Arab armies of Islam that come into Palestine and settle it beginning in the 7th century, who become the Palestinian Arab community. Obviously, there had been local indigenous peoples in the region prior to that. They used to be known as Canaanites or Hivites or Hittites. There were Philistines who came over the sea, Phoenicians who came over the sea and settled there. There were Philistines. There were all kinds of different indigenous peoples. But in terms of Arab settlement, it starts in the 7th century. And on the fourth line, when did local Arabs rule this land? Never. They got to live under a caliphate from Baghdad or the empires, the Crusader kingdom, or empires from North Africa, or 400 years under the Ottomans from Turkey. There had never been a local Arab sovereignty over the land. 500 years they've lived there, and they've never been able to rule themselves. This is why the question is, whose land is it? I want to give you a little mental break from all the history and names and dates and all of that and offer you an analogy and a little story. Imagine that there's a wonderful couple who live in their home together and have a child. And that child grows up in the home, living in the beautiful northeast gray bedroom with the window looking out on the park. And the child spends their entire childhood growing up there, grade school, middle school, high school. And eventually they have to leave home, obviously. So they move out. They get their own place, they go somewhere else, they get a job, they go to college, whatever, but they're out. Lo and behold, December surprise, the couple has another child. And that child grows up in the lovely gray second floor bedroom on the northeast corner with the big window looking out over the park. It's their bedroom. It's the only one they've ever known. And they grow up there until their senior year in high school, when their older sibling, 20 years older, falls on hard times, loses the job, and guess what? Has to move back home and says, I want my bedroom back. You tell me, whose bedroom is it? If you look at the black lines on there, you can see that to the left of 135, the Jewish community has an incredibly solid case for saying, that's my land. And then beginning about 635 and up to 1897, the Palestinian community, even though they don't have sovereignty, there are hardly any Jews around. And they're the ones who live there and can say, that's my land. From 1897 to 1917, you've got both communities under the Ottoman Empire trying to establish some independence. And when the Ottoman Empire falls, they both say, now is our time. And out of that, now is our time, we get a Jewish nationalism called Zionism and a Palestinian Arab nationalism that both are oriented to that land. That is the conflict. Let's talk about Hamas and Gaza to bring this to today a little bit more. It's a little piece of this history that I've alluded to. Hamas is formed in 1988 as a wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, which actually got started in 1928 in Egypt. It is a religiously based Islamic resistance movement, grounded in their understanding of Islam and resisting the presence of anybody, particularly Jews, because Jews are the ones who have created the Jewish national home. But in their understanding, the land that was once ruled by Muslims from 635 to 1917, the land once ruled by Muslims is Muslim land to eternity, and it is defiled if anybody else gets control of it. They were founded in 1988. In 2005, Israel withdrew from Gaza as a part, honestly, of still trying to make the Oslo peace process work. In 2006, Hamas took control of Gaza by actually throwing out the other Palestinian parties who were part of the national government, and Hamas said, "That's fine, you take the West Bank, we rule Gaza." And in 2007, Israel declared Gaza hostile territory because of Hamas's resistance commitments, and together with Egypt imposed a blockade on Gaza in order that it not be able to arm itself and become a fortress base for attacks either to Egypt or to Israel in the future. And from that time to now, the last 16 years, it has just been cycles of rocket and infiltration attacks from Gaza by Hamas, with military responses against Hamas in Gaza by Israel. That's some of the most recent history. Well, that's our first dimension, is the history. And if I haven't put you to sleep, we have 3 more. We're going to go through those more quickly. But I hope that it's important. You can see why it's important to understand the particular dynamics of this conflict, which is about 2 nationalisms in the last 125 years, both of whom have no other land to look at as their land, and both of whom want to be able to live as free people in their own land. It's tough. Quickly, to go through geopolitics through the ages, because we know well that this area is not just about Jews and Arabs who live there. There are all kinds of wider geopolitical interests. And this one really does go back to time immemorial. Between the Arabian Desert and the Mediterranean Sea, this little strip of land has always been a crossroads for trade and for military movement and conflict. It was true already in the 2nd millennium BCE between Egypt and Mesopotamia, and continued throughout antiquity that way. In the 12th century, it was the geopolitics of the Christian crusaders from Europe and the Muslim Arabs who lived there. When the Christian crusaders decided they had to reclaim the holy city and the holy land for Christ and for the church, and marched their armies down and established a 100-year-long kingdom before they were thrown out again. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, the geopolitics were between the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, which controlled it, and European empires, German, French, Dutch, English, to a certain extent American, who had interest in this area of the Middle East, and increasingly over these 400 years. Why? Because the world went to a carbon-based fuel economy. And those huge oil reserves that sit nearby are really most accessible precisely from this strip of land, unless you're going to try to somehow oust Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Iran. But this little strip of land became the closest that other world powers could get to exercise some influence over the oil trade. Mid-20th century, that became the US and Western axis against the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And in the 21st century, probably very relevant to what's happening in the last 11 days, the geopolitics have shifted to where Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, have really warmed to both Israel and the Western nations, and Iran is the one that is sitting out the game and seeing a block of political influence marshaling around Saudi Arabia, and just in recent months, the possibility of a Saudi-Israeli normalization of relations would leave Iran very much out in the cold. And so the geopolitics have always played a role in this region and continue to in this case. Our third dimension is religion. Is this a battle? The underlying context is the conflict between Islam and Judaism. And the simple answer is, it's not. It's not because both of these nationalisms are essentially secular in character. The state of Israel's population is 20% not Jewish. In fact, it's about 17% Palestinian Arab. In the Palestinian community, in Gaza and the West Bank, in Palestine, about 2 to 3% of the population is Christian. Among Palestinians globally, about 6 to 7% of Palestinians are Christian. So this is really, in its broadest context, Jewish Palestinian or Israeli Palestinian, but it is not fundamentally Muslim Jewish. In the early days of Israel, there was a group of ultra-Orthodox Jews who were happy to live in Israel because it is the land where they can most fully live out their Jewish life with all the agricultural lifestyle designs and going up to Jerusalem for the 3 festivals every year, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they were delighted to live in the state of Israel under Jewish political organization, but they refused to recognize the state as a Jewish state because only the Messiah can institute the Jewish state at the end of time. So we actually have anti-Zionist Jews who are glad to be able to live in the land but want nothing to do with the state. So no, it is not fundamentally religious. But here's the anomaly. Both Palestinians and Israel have strongly religiously motivated minorities. In Israel, they're known as religious Zionists, and they will not call the territory that used to be Jordan, that is now occupied, the West Bank, because as far as they're concerned, it only ever has been, is, and will be Judea and Samaria, which are biblical names for that territory. Their motivation is religious, to reestablish the whole biblical land of Israel under Jewish sovereignty. And what you see in that map on the screen is a map from 2020 of the religious and secular Zionist settlements in what the Oslo Accords would say is to be Palestine. There are about 9 or 10 Palestinian cities among the names. I know you can't read that. There are about 9 or 10 Palestinian cities that are named up there as well. But virtually every name you see in the light brown West Bank area of that map is a Jewish settlement in the West Bank. And the movement of that settlement is driven primarily by religious Zionists. And on the Palestinian side, the religiously motivated minority is Hamas, which says in its charter, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. I mentioned before the idea of the Islamic trust. This land was once ruled by Muslims. It is therefore Muslim land until the end of time, or until the judgment day, as they say. And for anyone else to rule there is an abomination. Ironically, when we put religion and politics together in this, both of these religiously motivated minorities have the power they do within their communities for politically opposite reasons. Religious Zionists wield outsized power in the Israeli government because Israel has a parliamentary democracy. And in a parliamentary democracy, you're constantly making coalitions in order to get to your 61-seat majority in the parliament in order to be able to rule. And the religious Zionists may only have 5 or 6 or 7 seats in that parliament, but if they're the last 5 or 6 or 7 that a larger party needs in order to cement its coalition, in order to be able to rule, the tail wags the dog. And in a democratic parliamentary democracy, the religiously motivated minority gets outsized control. Hamas does it the other way. They had slightly more than half of the Palestine National Council vote in 2005 when the vote was taken. But they didn't have all of it. And when they took Gaza in 2006, they kicked out all the other political parties, outlawed them, drove them out in some cases violently, and they've not had elections since then. They just hang on to power. So democratically or non-democratically, these religiously motivated minorities have wielded outsized power. And as you can imagine, I want to move now into our fourth dimension, and that is human nature. If you are a Palestinian and you look at that map of the West Bank, what's supposed to be Palestine, and you see all of those Jewish settlements in it, Israeli settlements in it, and the people who live there won't even call it the West Bank or Palestine. They insist on it being their Judea and Samaria. And you know you have nowhere else to go in the world. It might conjure a little bit of fear about whether, as a Palestinian community, you might just culturally or literally fade out of existence, be destroyed. And if you're a Jew in Israel and you read the Hamas charter and see that Hamas's aim is to obliterate you as Islam has obliterated others in the past, and there are case studies that can be called up to validate that, you just might live with a measure of fear of your annihilation. At one level, the people in both of these communities engage the questions of their competing nationalisms and their efforts somehow to live side by side. At a very deep level, they are operating out of fear. Deep fear, literally for their lives. And that dimension of what happens whenever there's a flare-up in violence or an opportunity to gain a little more security is incredibly powerful. There's another distinction between these two societies by and large, speaking broadly, not about every single individual in them, but by and large, Arab society operates with what's known as an honor-shame system. So the relationships between people within society are based on each individual offering the appropriate honor to the other individual and not suffering shame from anyone. Part of the issue with the Islamic trust and the problem with having somebody else rule the land is that that's sort of like the biggest shame that Hamas can imagine collectively. But it moves all the way from the schoolyard to that massive geopolitical scale, that the dynamics by which you relate to each other are honor and shame, and making sure that you preserve your own honor, especially that you offer honor to others, and that nobody gets shamed in the process. Israeli society, by and large, operates on a Western sort of rational justice basis. So it's not about whether you feel honored or shamed. It's about whether you're getting the fair piece of the pie that collectively we decide is yours to have. And we know that doesn't always work in terms of everybody getting a fair piece of the pie, but at least that's the basis on which we operate. And there are any number of times when a justice-based approach to a social conflict ends up resulting in shame if someone is reading on the honor-shame scale. So there's a kind of cultural, fundamental tension there as well. Thirdly, we all, as human beings, have a certain amount of tribalism in us. It's sort of cooked into that oldest part of our brain about knowing who's safe and who's not, who's friend and who's foe, when I have to fight and when I have to flee, or when I can just relax. And the dynamics of tribalism also play significantly into this, as does a yearning for clarity, consistency, and certainty. That's what I promised you wouldn't have this evening, you remember? But we all have that sense. I don't like it to be unsettled. I don't like it when I'm not sure what's going to happen next. I don't like it when the lines aren't clear. It's uncomfortable. And so the inclination to jump to one position or another is very tempting. The difficulty with that one, and let's admit that all of these human dynamics are not just true about them over there in the Middle East, they're also true about all of us. What are my fears about what might happen out of this conflict? How much do I feel shame or my honor impinged by something that's going on? Or how much do I just insist that there's a justice that we can calculate, and by God, that's what we ought to be imposing, is justice in this case? How much do I identify with one or another of the groups that's involved in this, and my tribalism gets caught up in all of it? And how much do I think I just need to know what's right and be able to count on that? It seems to me there's something deep in our faith traditions, all of our faith traditions, whatever they are, about recognizing that, especially in a situation this complicated, the first thing we ought to reach for is our humility, how much we don't know. For everything that I'm sharing with you tonight, mostly what I said to people when they asked me earlier yesterday or today, so are you ready for tomorrow night? I said, heavens no. I don't know nearly enough. I'm not sure I have a clue. There's a deep humility about being a person of God and recognizing how limited we are and how dependent we are on God and God's wisdom that suggests that the kind of certainty, the kind of clarity, the kind of absolutism that would have us jump one way or the other probably is not faithful, probably is not a spiritual good, as much as I know I want it. And the last piece of human nature, and this gets back to right where I started with the tragedy that's unfolding in front of us, and that is the deep feelings of grief and anger and powerlessness when we face a situation like this. We just feel helpless. And that also drives us into aligning with something that might feel like it gives us a little more power or control. But even there, the sense of powerlessness, the sense of grief, the sense of anger, all of which are honest feelings that emerge, cannot sap from us what, again, our faith and our religious life gives us, which is a sense of conscience and compassion. As hard as it is to continue to be compassionate in the midst of anger, as hard as it is to continue to listen to my conscience when I am just racked with grief and frustration and feel powerlessness. But that too is a gift that we have from our lives of faith, whatever that faith is. So all of these human nature factors come into play. They come into play over there. They come into play here. Our sense of humility and our sense of compassion can buttress us in dealing with them. And I would suggest that, finally, if we're actually involved in a conflict, then being aware of these human dynamics can help us to navigate that conflict more constructively. And if we're not involved in the conflict, but observers to it, then it's really helpful to recognize them so that we can't be manipulated into being on one side or the other of that conflict, rather than embracing the suffering that's going on, what one friend of mine calls bilateral solidarity. Not being for one side or the other at the expense of the opposite, but being for the resolution, being for the relationship, being for what could be tomorrow. We're at 8:30. You have been wonderfully patient. They're great pews, but you can't sit in them all night. Thank you mostly for caring enough to be here. God bless.